Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm just going to share my screen here in a second. Carly, actually, you need to make me the presenter. Can you give me those controls? Perfect. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the tech difficulties getting us going this afternoon, but welcome to our webinar on new housing laws, funding, and programs. I'm Melissa Keene, a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and will be your host and moderator this afternoon. A quick overview of our agenda today. We're going to do just some quick welcome and logistics. And then I'm going to share some information about some upcoming resources that ILG has coming out related to this topic that might be of interest to you all. Then we're going to go into presentations. We have Sohab Mahmood, a housing policy specialist with the Department of Housing and Community Development, Chris Lee, a legislative representative with the California State Association of Counties, and Jason Ryan, the Assistant Legislative Director with the League of California Cities. After we hear presentations, we will go into a Q&A. We're hoping to have plenty of time to get through a lot of questions this afternoon, as we expect you all probably have quite a few. And then we will wrap up and adjourn by 3:30. A quick note about how to ask a question during the webinar. You probably noticed that your line has been muted, and you will be muted for the duration of the webinar. But as I just mentioned, that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So on your right-hand control panel of your screen, you should see a box that says questions. You can type a question in there at any point during the webinar. And as I just mentioned, we'll get to some during the Q&A. And if we've got time throughout the presentation, we'll take clarifying questions as they come in. Just a quick overview about ILG in case you're not familiar with us. We are the nonprofit affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources so that local agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We do a lot of training and education, like this webinar. We also do conference sessions, in-person training when it's available, and a lot of other pieces there. We provide technical assistance and capacity building services to local governments, as well as convening services and a lot of written resources on our website. We have 4 main focus areas. We focus on leadership and governance, civics education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable communities. Just a quick note about how we are plugging into the housing work before we get started this afternoon. We are part of the Statewide Housing Technical Assistance Program and are working in that space in a number of ways. We've been part of the technical assistance team that's going out regionally to talk to cities and counties and hear about some of your challenges and barriers to housing development, and how we as a technical assistance team can plug in and help you resolve some of those things or give you resources and training to help address some of that. In addition, we are updating our Planning Commissioner's Handbook, and we'll be conducting some corresponding trainings coming into 2022. And then we're doing this webinar series, which is a series for local leaders on a number of housing topics. This is the last one in the series. We've done 8 of these so far. And at the end of the webinar, I will share the link where all of those archived webinars can be found on demand in case you want to go back and listen to any that you missed. Quick note about the Planning Commissioner's Handbook. So this has been a flagship publication for ILG, and we are in the process of updating it, and it should be online by the end of this year. We convened a working group to help us think through the updates that needed to be made and are taking a digital-first approach to this. So it'll be a website, but we'll also have a corresponding PDF that folks can download on a number of different topics. These are the different topics that we'll be covering in that handbook. Won't read through those, but that's what you can expect when it comes online, a lot of different pieces there. And then we'll be conducting corresponding planning commissioners trainings going into 2022 on a regional basis that will cover a lot of the basics around roles and responsibilities, the planning process around land use and CEQA and things like that, and then some specifics on a regional basis related to resiliency and equity and some regional challenges that we've been hearing. So as I mentioned, we have 3 presenters today. I will go ahead and kick it over to Sohab, who's going to talk about some of the funding that is coming down to help you all work on this issue. So Sohab?
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm going to go into two components that HCD is working on right now. One of it is funding for affordable housing to support local governments in approving and helping build affordable housing. And then the second is technical assistance, which is really just local government support in assisting them with implementing housing policies. Next slide, please. You can just go over that slide too. So quickly on the funding, here are some key programs you want to keep an eye on. Either they are upcoming or they are going to, or they are current right now. So one program that just recently launched is the Encampment Resolution Funding Program. This is a program to provide cities and counties with funding to put together resources that can help individuals who are living in encampments. And then in addition to helping individuals who are living in encampments and serving their needs and finding them hopefully permanent housing, it can also be used for restoring the encampment sites to its intended use after enough resources have been allocated to help individuals or people experiencing homelessness find permanent housing. So that program is ongoing, or it just started. They're accepting applications up until December 2021. A program that is coming up is the Regional Early Action Planning Grants. You guys may have been familiar with this. It's called, we call it REAP. There was a REAP program that launched this year and last year for regional governments, so COGS and counties and some working groups. And it was, before that, it was the SB2 and LEAP dollars allocated directly towards local governments. So this is the second version of REAP. It is $600 million. It was partially funded by federal dollars as well. And it is to fund implementation activities of regional plans that accelerate housing production, especially infill housing, and reduce VMT. It does have an expectation that some of that funding will be allocated as subgrants to cities and counties within that region. Right now, we are working on putting out a framing paper. So this is to help scope out what that program should look like. When that paper is available, we will be looking for public comments, everyone's input on what they would like to see in the program, what could be improved, especially if you are familiar with the program. So keep an eye out on that, and I'll make sure to coordinate with Melissa if anyone's interested in getting a hold of that framing paper. But as far as the funding allocation, we are expecting to start allocating funding and accepting applications from regional governments, so COGS and counties, in spring of 2022. Another program that is ongoing, current, it was a very successful program, and so now we have a second version of it. It's called HomeKey 2.0. It has $1.45 billion of funding, and if you're not familiar with HomeKey 2.0, it is converting hotels, motels, and really any commercial properties that might be suitable for housing into permanent or interim housing for specific target populations, such as people experiencing homelessness and extremely low-income households. So that program is currently accepting applications. Next slide, please. Another couple programs that are coming up, so is the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, IIG. So if you're not familiar with this one, it provides financial assistance for capital improvement projects that promote infill housing. They are expecting, I put an estimated date, but roughly anywhere around February, March, or maybe you can consider it just spring 2022 to have the no-fund guidelines out for the IIG program. A couple other programs is the Permanent Local Housing Allocation Program, PLHA, that provides funding for pre-development costs, development, acquisition, rehab, and preservation of housing for lower income households. They are currently accepting applications for that right now. It is an allocation to most entitlement cities. So if you aren't aware of that program, or if you don't know if you've applied to it yet, I would definitely follow up to make sure that your city is involved in applying for that allocation. Another program that's currently accepting applications is the Joe Cerna Farm Worker Housing Program, which is specifically targeted at providing construction, rehab, and acquisition of units for ag workers. And lastly, to sum up all of these programs, HCD is launching a more streamlined application for many of these programs where you can apply to these programs using just one application. These programs include MHP, which I didn't mention in the table, VIP, which is also known as the Veterans Homeless Housing Program, the Joe Cerna program, the TOD, that's Transit Oriented Development, IIG, which I had mentioned, and what we will have is one application and one NOFA for all of these programs, which is anticipated to release around February 2022. Next slide, please. So now, with all these funding and a lot of the new laws that passed, I'm going to talk about some of the statewide and regional efforts that we're currently doing and we're going to continue to do to help support local governments. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview, the state does have both a statewide technical assistance program that has been regionally customized for each region across the state. We've customized this TA program for about 30 regions with the understanding that not one region is the same. For example, even within Southern California, what Imperial County needs when it comes to resources and assistance is going to be very different towards what jurisdictions in LA County needs. But basically, this is a program that is working to identify all local governments' needs when it comes to housing planning. So, when it comes to implementing new laws, understanding new laws, updating housing elements, applying and implementing certain housing policy strategies, such as certain zoning strategies, design standards, and even helping with assisting in public engagement strategies. This program is meant to help you identify those needs and then identify either statewide tools or regional tools that can be developed through HCD that can help assist you in those needs. So the way we're doing that is through customized regional technical delivery plans. So these are basically plans very clearly stating that this is the needs that your local government's identified, and this is how HCD is going to deliver to address those needs. It includes, in these regional plans, it includes a suite of statewide tools. Again, these are tools that can be applied across the state to all cities and counties. And then it's going to include regional tools that can be more customized for a region based on, unique differences or geographic variations in the region. And then there'll also be tools that can be customized for maybe more urban geographies versus rural, tools that are better served for higher resource communities versus communities that have lower resources or less capacity. Also, these tools, like I said, these tools and resources, they're going to be meant to directly identify the needs that local governments have identified. And so what we've done in the last 2 years is we have surveyed every local government. We have also done one-on-one calls and feedback with almost every local government in the state. And we collected all of their feedback to understand at a regional level basis and a local level basis, what are the challenges you are all facing when it comes to implementing housing policy, when it comes to approving housing, building housing. And then from there, with our consultant team, what are the tools that we can create to help you address those needs? And all of these tools and resources are going to be populated into a statewide clearinghouse. So it's going to be one website, one place where you can find every tool you need. You can click on your region if we have something regionally specific for you, and then you can also click on topic areas. The image that you see in this picture is what the statewide clearinghouse currently looks like, is currently live, and you can click on a particular topic, and in that topic we'll have the tools listed that we've developed so far. This program is running anywhere from 2023 to 2024. So for the next couple of years, we're going to be continuing to populate as quickly as possible with all the tools and resources that your cities and counties are identifying that they need to address their housing challenges. Next slide, please. And just to give you, to help you conceptualize what these technical assistance delivery plans look like, this is an example of one that we've done for the San Joaquin Valley. These plans are finalized plans as of right now, but they can always be revised, but they are real plans that you can actually download and have a copy of if you would like, that clearly identify, as you can see in the right-hand side, it clearly states the needs that were identified by a specific county or region, and then it states what are the tools and resources HCD has identified to help them address those needs. And we're still working on the schedule of when those tools will be available, but as we've been consulting with counties and cities, we're also working on trying to scope out what that tool should look like so it can really identify or address their housing challenges. So if you are interested, feel free to let us know. We can send you a copy of your regional TA plan if you're curious to see some of the needs and some of the commitments that HCD is making to address those needs. Next slide, please. And just to give you an overview of what is currently available right now that you can find on this clearinghouse that I discussed, which is on our website. When it comes to checklists and ordinances, you can download checklists and ordinances on a variety of these topic areas listed, including by right zoning, emergency shelters, supportive housing, reasonable accommodation. And the idea behind this is that, most of us are going to be developing ordinances to comply with state law, as it all applies to all of us. And the idea is that since we're all going to be developing the same ordinance, why don't we just have one ordinance that a city can download off of our website and customize if they feel like they need to, and then go ahead and start working off that instead of recreating the same thing, adding cost and time to the local government budget. And so these are things that we've so far have developed. We've also developed a housing element compliance flyer. This is for local governments, and they can use it in both city council meetings or with their community members when there are questions about why is compliance good and why should we have compliance. Other things that we have that are currently developed is a guidebook on public engagement, a guidebook on objective design and development standards, on affirmatively furthering for housing, ADUs, and a guidebook on housing planning costs. Next slide, please. And lastly, these are some of the tools that we are working on as of right now and hope to have available in the next couple months. So when it relates to new housing laws, we are working on a fact sheet, decision trees, standard PowerPoint slide decks that staff can use, staff reports, and trainings to understand new laws and also understand how to implement new laws. When it comes to housing policy implementation, we'll be working on a variety of tools that are not only tools that you can just download from our website, but trainings and assistance that we can provide you one-on-one to implement a lot of these new housing laws, including a help desk, including one-on-one assistance, including plug and play draft ordinances on other topics that were not covered in the previous slide. And then when it comes to building support and engagement, we understand that with these tools and new laws, that's one piece of it, but it's also about making sure that we have our community on board when it comes to adopting and addressing these new laws, and also being educated on what these laws mean and how do we implement them and how does it work in our community. So to do that, there's a couple things we're working on right now. Melissa had mentioned earlier, we do have the Planning Commissioner's Handbook, which will be followed up with Planning Commissioner's trainings that can be regionally customized. We are scoping out what we can do to support local elected officials. So I have a bullet point in there to a question for all of you on what are the tools that you could use on a daily basis when you're reviewing housing elements and you're approving housing elements, or when you're approving housing projects, or when you're just generally talking about housing. What are tools that we can create to help you support that effort? Another thing that we're developing is a housing element video. This is a video to explain in very layman's terms what housing element means and why it's important. We found that there was a handful of local governments across the state that were creating the same video, and it was costing a lot of money for each city to do that. And HCD found an opportunity where we can just develop a video that can be used for every single city and county and customize if they would like to, rather than, again, one city having to recreate the same thing that may have already been created. So that housing element video, it can be used at city council meetings. It can be used with your community members when they're unsure about what a housing element is or what's the point. It will be available hopefully in the next month or so. We are at the final stages. And so that's something that you can download off of our website. We'll also be working on graphics to explain certain housing policy topics. I think, if you're very technical when it comes to housing and planning world, we understand very clearly when we're talking about density and design standards and zoning. But when we're talking to the general public or just people who are not really in this field, what do these policies look like and what does it really mean? And so we'll be creating graphics and animations and really visuals to help you really understand on a very visual basis what these topics mean, and help you communicate that with your community as well. We'll also be developing things like FAQs, flyers, handouts. Again, we're just trying to find all the tools that local governments can use when it comes to housing issues. And so we're also really looking to hear from all of you on what are additional tools that especially local elected officials need when it comes to addressing housing challenges in your community. Lastly, we will be, in addition to building support and engagement around housing, we will be touching on housing finance. It's also in a lot of communities, sometimes you do have the planning in place, you do have the housing policies implemented, but it's hard to get the financing of both the housing and the infrastructure done. And so we'll be looking at what tools and products can we create both for a regional basis, on a statewide basis, on an urban basis, on a also rural level, on how to address and help cities and counties learn more about housing finance and what they can do to help support financing of affordable housing. Next slide, please. And that's my presentation. So I really appreciate all of you guys here today. We wanted to make sure you're well aware of our technical assistance program. It is meant to support all local elected officials in all cities and counties in implementing housing policies. So please do not hesitate to reach out if you guys have any questions. Now I will pass it on to Jason and Chris.
Thank you, Sohab. Just a quick note for the folks on the line before we turn it over to Jason and Chris. We will share the link to the Housing Hub site that Sohab mentioned with those tools in the follow-up email, so you'll have access to that. And then, as she mentioned, if you have any suggestions for tools or things that would be really helpful in your community, definitely feel free to drop those into our questions box as well, and we can track them that way and make sure that they get shared. So definitely feel free to share things that way. Sohab, we did get one clarifying question on the IIG grant. Do you want to take that quickly now before we move on?
Sure. I'm not a program expert, but I can try. And if I can't figure out the answer, I can get you the answer. So go for it.
Perfect. So the question is if those grant funds can be used for housing preservation infrastructure projects like seismic retrofitting.
Okay. Don't know the answer, but let me follow up with our program staff and hopefully I can get you one by the end of this webinar.
Perfect. All right. So we will get back to the person that responded to that question. So perfect. Thanks so much. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jason and Chris to talk about some of the new legislation that just came out of this most recent legislative session. Jason, I think you're up first.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Really appreciate it. As you all can see on the screen here, Chris and I's contact information is there, so please, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or want some additional follow-up following this webinar. So please do reach out. Go ahead, next slide. So the first bill here we're going to talk about is SB 9. But before I jump into that, I want to give you just a little bit of background on just the legislative year that we've seen this year with regard to housing and land use. We saw, dozens and dozens of bills introduced again this year in the legislative session. Last year, when we were going through, the height of COVID, we saw a lot of bills just fall to the wayside. This year, the legislature really got back to its normal, number of bill introductions. I want to say it was like 2,700 or so bills were introduced. And, I think it was like 600 or 700, 800 may have made it to the governor's desk. So lots and lots of bills actually got through this year. With regard to housing and land use, Chris and I, we work hard on a lot of these bills. We team up on a lot of stuff. Local government, we tend to see eye to eye on a number of these measures. And we were pretty successful this year in getting amendments into bills that were of major concern. We helped, stall out some other bills that we'll have to deal with next year. But this talk here is really about some of the bigger items that the governor actually signed and that our cities and counties need to pay attention to as we go into the end of the year here. So SB 9 is a bill that got probably the most attention this year. I want to say we had about 144 cities team up with the League of California Cities and oppose this measure. And I know we had, many county folk as well. The best way to think of this bill, the simplest terms really, is that it's going to require our local governments to ministerially approve housing developments that contain 2 units in our single family zones. And again, we got to do that ministerially, which means without any conditions, without any review, that it's just going to be an over-the-counter sort of permit process. So we have to allow for at least 2 units in these single-family zones. And then we're also going to be required to ministerially approve a lot split as well. So taking 1 lot, subdividing it, now we have 2 lots. And then on each one of those lots, you can have 2 units on those lots. Now, as you can see on this slide here, there's some really important provisions in the bill as well that provide local governments with a little bit more authority. One here is with regard to owner occupancy. So there was a big concern that developers and hedge funds were going to come in and buy up a bunch of land and then just sell it off, split it, have multiple homes in these single-family neighborhoods. This provision actually is a good one in that it will allow us to have an owner occupancy requirement, in our jurisdictions. The one thing to note about the owner occupancy requirement is that it's really just a signed affidavit. So the landowner is pledging that they're going to live in in one of the homes. And, you know, an affidavit really isn't the strongest thing, but at least there's, you know, something in the law that says, hey, you got to live in at least one of those, you know, developments. The other thing that's important to note here is that we cannot require offsite improvements as part of, you know, the development. But importantly, though, we can have objective standards as long as those objective standards do not make the project infeasible. So we can still have design review standards. We can have a whole host of objective standards, but they just have to be done in a way that still allow for the creation of those 2 units on the lots. And then one of the last things here too is that a compliant project must be approved unless the local government makes certain findings. So, you know, we can, in some very limited instances, deny a project, but we have to show through a preponderance of evidence that there's a health or safety risk that cannot be mitigated. And that's a really high legal bar. So for the most part, we're going to have to allow for the creation of these units in a single family neighborhood unless we can have really strong evidence and it's really to protect public health and safety. Now, the last thing I would like to say about this is that within the context of the bill itself, there are many, many other requirements. So it's not as if a developer can put these units anywhere they want. There are many site limitations. There's demolition requirements or limitations. So you'll really want to take a close look, have your city attorney and county attorney take a close look at the language of the bill, because it's going to be very site specific. You know, it really depends on the size of the lots you have in your community, just the way the lots are oriented. So it's not a complete blank slate. I mean, you got to be in an urban cluster area or an urban area via the census. So there are really important distinctions. So it's not going to apply uniformly everywhere. The other thing to really keep in mind too is that this is going to be heavily reliant on human behavior and what, you know, homeowners want to do with their property. Are they going to want to have, you know, somebody live immediately adjacent to them, you know, on a relatively small lot? So it's hard to gauge how many units will be constructed to this, but it is something to keep an eye on and take a very close look at. And with that, I know we're going to stop here for a second and see if there are any technical questions that we can help resolve. If not, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide.
No, perfect. Thanks, Jason. As he just mentioned, if you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to drop those in the questions box right now. We do have a couple. The first question is, will there be guidance on this bill available before January 1st?
That's a very good question. I can certainly answer from Cal City's perspective. I mean, Chris Lee, I definitely turn him afterwards. From us, yes, we are in the process. There's going to be 2 upcoming opportunities to talk about SB9 in greater detail. One is on December 1st. Cal Cities is hosting our new laws webinar, which will include all the new laws that are pertinent to cities. And we will have much more information about SB9 on that as well. We're also in the process of teaming up with our city attorney's department to put on a supplemental webinar focused really just on SB9. So the details of that are still being ironed out, but that'll be coming out definitely before January 1st.
And I'll just, oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, you know, we did a write-up in today's CSAC bulletin on all new laws in the housing, land use, and transportation space. So there's a brief write-up on SB9 there that links to a much more comprehensive description from when the bill was signed a few weeks ago. So that's probably the most exhaustive resource that we'll develop. But again, if there's specific questions, we have the County Councils Association land use working group, and they're actively looking at all the new laws as well.
And I'll just quickly add from HCD's front, we are working on a very thorough guidance on SB9. If you've seen our accessory dwelling units guidebook, it's going to be very similar. It's also going to give you guidance on how, if you would like to use SB9 towards counting it toward your arena. We do hope that that guidebook will be available more towards February of next year, so not January, but close. But we hope that that will be available towards February of next year.
Perfect. And I will make sure to all of those things that are available now, including information about the webinar Jason mentioned and the write-up that Chris mentioned from the CSAC bulletin, we'll make sure to link to those as possible in the follow-up email here too. So you guys have all of that in one space. There's a couple of additional questions here. One is if there's any anticipation of a cleanup on the bill to address things like how and when to allow ADUs in things like very high fire hazard zones or anything like that. Do you expect any additional?
Yeah,
amendments?
that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. And, mentioning the very high hazard fire severity zones, I mean, this is something that Chris and I have been fighting together for years. And it really dates back to SB 35, where there's the exemption for construction in these areas, but it's really an exemption that doesn't exempt anything, because as long as you follow the building code, you can still do it. And multiple laws since then have borrowed the same language, and SB 9 certainly has as well. We have fought really, really hard to provide our local governments with greater flexibility in those areas, and we've been rebuffed the whole time. So given how contentious this measure was throughout the entire legislative year this year, and even dating back to last year, Chris, maybe if you correct me if I'm wrong, but I really don't anticipate Atkins wanting to rehash anything or try to fix anything, at least in the next year or so. I'd be a little surprised.
Yeah, I agree with Jason. It has been a bit of a frustrating conversation there. It is I'd say cross-reference to an SB 35 provision. A lot of people get it wrong what the language means, some of whom are well-meaning, and I think others would just rather hide the ball a little bit, I'll just say. SB 35 has a sunset, so it's an issue that I will certainly be raising in the context of that, but because it's functioning as a cross-reference to that other law, I don't anticipate there'll be a lot of desire. And I think the reason for the amendment related to the preponderance of evidence, if you can't resolve the health and safety issue, was put into the bill as an alternative to changing some of the language around the fire hazards. That's my personal take. I don't know what the actual thinking was, but for whatever reason, I think the staff in the Senate really want to have a set parameters of, these are the areas where we don't want by right processes to happen, and they want to have one set, right? And so now we're kind of in each bill pushing against that tide. So it's a frustration, but I do think it's something that we'll continue to raise, and we just want to have a level of agreement around what the language means, and just a recognition of is it in a by right process where you can't require any off-site improvements, which would be things like in the public right-of-way in a neighborhood. Does it make sense to allow intensification in a high fire hazard severity zone? We've said no, but that's the debate.
Great, thank you for that clarification. There's another question about the owner occupancy comments that you were making, Jason. So does SB 9 require owner occupancy, or does it allow for jurisdictions to require owner occupancy?
Yeah, if my memory serves, I believe it allows the jurisdiction to require it. Chris, maybe I'm mistaken there, but what the important thing to note on that is that it's an affidavit. It's not as strong as actually requiring the landowner to live in one of the dwellings. It's just more of like a pledge. So, when our attorneys took a look at it, they felt that it was going to be really hard to enforce since it is just an affidavit. But, it is something, though. I think we'll definitely encourage our jurisdictions to include that and to have an owner occupancy requirement. I mean, for anything else, to at least slow down that land rush, or perhaps make these units maybe a little bit more affordable, because you won't have maybe investors that are looking to flip it and turn it really fast. That it's going to be more of a longer term investment for somebody or for a family member or something of that nature.
I think it is a requirement, but I think we will definitely look to our write-up again and confirm that. I believe it is a requirement for the bill to be used, and so it's putting local agencies in a position of, as Jason mentioned, this is potentially not a great enforcement tool. So I think it does put cities and counties in a tough spot.
Okay, great. I think with that, let's go ahead and keep moving through this so we make sure we've got question time at the end to talk about other bills as needed. And so if you have submitted a question, we will try to get to as many of those as possible in the full Q&A at the end. Otherwise, we will also share contact information for folks so you can follow up offline as needed. So give you the next slide there. Chris, Jason?
And this one will be me. I think this one was a three-peat, not just a repeat like some of the others we had in 2021, but The Housing Crisis Act of 2019, that was SB 330, made some really significant changes, created this new preliminary application process. Once you have a completed application in that preliminary process, some of the standards that apply to the project are told basically throughout the review period until the project is going forward, including some of the fee calculations and things of that nature. There's a limitation on the number of hearings that a project can have. There's a very strong limitation on downzoning and a requirement that if you do downzone in the particular areas where it's allowed under that bill, that you make up the capacity elsewhere in the jurisdiction. But really, it's about kind of freezing the standards that are in place when an application is submitted and providing developers with some certainty about what's going to be required for that particular project. So this bill takes that SB 330, and the biggest change it makes is extending the sunset out to 2030. I honestly thought they would come back and make this permanent in the second try, but this is a 5-year extension. As noted in the slide here, the protections continue to apply for projects that are submitted by that date for an additional 4 years to 2034. And then there's some clarifying amendments in here about the definition of what constitutes a housing development project for the purposes of SB 330. So it explicitly draws in both discretionary and ministerial projects, as well as projects to construct just a single unit. So pretty significant bill, but a lot of the details were very closely, hotly negotiated between cities, counties, and the bill's proponents in that 2019 bill, SB 330. Go to the next slide.
Okay, I think it looks like I'm up here. SB 10, this is another bill that was, pretty hotly debated in the legislature. This one really is regarding a Sql exemption, and it doesn't require cities or counties to do anything. It actually allows them and empowers a city or county to take certain upzoning actions if they see fit and if they think it's best for their community. So you'll see here that it has a sunset date, so until 2029. A city or county can pass an ordinance that basically allows for up to 10 units of residential density to be, constructed on certain parcels. Now, these parcels need to be located near, transit. It has to be a transit-rich area, which generally means it has to be high interval, 15-minute peak commute intervals, and it needs to be an urban infill site. So there's really important distinctions here. Additionally, it purports to create an exemption to any locally approved ballot measure. So if you have a voter approved initiative at the local level that's restricting growth or development in some fashion, this tries to provide a pathway for a city to take action in order to override that. But it does carve out certain locally approved measures, such as those that are designating open space or recreational purposes. So those wouldn't be included. The best way really to look at this is that it's an exemption from this upzoning for CEQA. So if a city wants to do this or a county wants to do this, they can. They just have to follow the requirements of the bill. But again, it does not mandate the city or county to do anything. Okay, next slide.
This is one of the funnest bills to talk about because it's the most jargon maybe for the year. So this bill, SB 478 by Senator Weiner, basically creates some default zoning standards that apply when a city or county has designated certain areas for projects of 3 to 10 residential units. So a big point of the debate on this was, well, how does this interact with SB 9? How does it interact with ADU single family zoning? So there were a lot of clarifying amendments taken to specify it's not applying to single family zones. It's specifically where you have zoning for projects of 3 to 10 units. The bill basically creates a floor for floor area ratio, so measurement of bulk of buildings, the area of the building is compared to the size of the lot. And so when a city or county has zoned for 3 to 7 units, the bill says the floor area ratios that applies to that project has to be at least 1.0. So if you have a 3,000 square foot lot, the allowable buildable area for those 3 to 10 units, 7 units would be 3,000 square feet. Bad example, because that's probably way too small for 3 to 7 units, but it was the number that popped into my head. And then for 8 to 10 units, the standard is 1.25. So same formula applies. So there's a limitation here for local agencies from denying a project that's zoned for these number of units explicitly because the legal parcel that it's on is below the allowable parcel size for that zoning standard. And then there's some really clear language in there specifying that the bill only precludes local zoning standards that conflict with the above limitations. So this was part of the discussion we had on the bill, making sure it was pretty narrowly tailored, because it's when you're doing these statewide sort of zoning things, it's really difficult to imagine all the different standards and things that could apply. So appreciated those amendments. And then finally, there's related to covenants, conditions, and restrictions, some overrides there where those private limitations on the use of a property preclude this type of project. So again, this is a statewide standard really designed to ease the way for projects, this missing middle sort of housing type by creating some basic standards that local agencies need to be consistent with. Next slide.
Before we move on, Chris, if I could just say a couple quick things. One, and Chris highlighted this in the beginning. What's really important to note and underscore is that this is really only multifamily in these mixed-use areas, multifamily areas, sites that we've already zoned. So we've already said, hey, it's okay to have multifamily in these areas. It's not, everywhere. It's not going to be in historic districts. It's not going to be in single-family neighborhoods. So that's really important to note. Additionally, from talking to some of our planners, we generally use, floor area ratio when we're talking about businesses, warehouses, those type of buildings, not so much in the housing context. So I think for many of our jurisdictions, it's going to be a little bit odd because we normally use, density or, some other measurement. We don't really use FAR so much. So it's going to take a little bit to get used to it. And so we'll see how it actually, goes moving forward.
Well, and just to add on to that, Jason, I think part of maybe the political calculus on this bill is as you're seeing a lot more jurisdictions move towards like form-based codes where floor area ratio, I think, plays a bigger role. It's kind of getting in front of that and creating some sort of default standard. So it's sort of an interesting, but we had the same reaction of, well, that's typically not what our zoning is based on. So kind of a curious proposal here.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so next slide, I think it's me. I think we're going to talk about AB 215. This is a bill that deals with housing element and violations, and it does a number of key things. This is a bill that we obviously fought tooth and nail, and we were a bit upset that it was so drastically changed at the very end of session, and really didn't have an adequate policy committee hearing on the measure. It was really a gut and amend at the end of session, and didn't get its day in court, and from my opinion at least. The things to really note about this bill, one is that it creates an additional 30-day period for comment within our housing element. So it's going to add some additional time, and then it adds like another 10 days or so on the back end for review. So it's like a 40-day additional period. It also then requires HCD to review our draft housing elements, and then there's 2 other timelines that they have to meet in order to provide us with written findings, 90 days after receiving that first draft, and then 60 for subsequent drafts. Now, there are 2 other really important provisions in the bill that gave us the most heartburn, was really around creating this 3-year statute of limitations for any action, enforcement action that's been brought under AB 72 from a few years ago. So there's a whole host of housing laws that can be, cities can be brought against, and this would allow a 3-year statute of limitations. So we're gonna have to look over our shoulders for 3 years. And then the final provision is it allows HCD to, seek outside counsel if the Attorney General decides not to pursue a case against the city. And we really view this as, outside counsel, shopping, that they can just, the AG doesn't want to do it. If the state's attorney doesn't want to bring a case, why are we going to allow HCD to have this ability to go seek their own attorney when the state's attorney said no? So that's a big change in the law from right now. So we'll see how that all plays out.
I'll just add, this bill started out, as Jason noted, being a really different bill. And we were successful in removing some provisions that we were really unhappy with. There was a provision basically making this voluntary process that was created in 2019, which we're hoping a lot of cities and counties apply for, basically getting bonus points in grant applications for showing all the policies that you've adopted that support housing development. Basically would have made that voluntary program into a mandate for the purpose of this bill. So we had a long debate, a lot of concerns about that. And as Jason mentioned, it really did become a new bill in August. So CSAC asked for a veto. Unfortunately, it was signed, but again, I think did get some improvements from a bill that started in a rough spot for us. The next slide. So AB 602 by Assemblymember Grayson, this is related to residential development impact fees. This is a bill that's really, this is a three-peat. There was a bill several years ago where the legislature asked the Department of Housing and Community Development to come back with a report on residential development impact fees and whether they were reasonable and ways to improve them, to improve the governance around them. And we saw some bills that took some pretty radical approaches. And this year we spent a lot of time working with the author, working with other stakeholders, trying to get to a better place where we were making sure that infrastructure that's needed to support new development can be funded while also improving the governance and transparency related to the impact fees. So some of the most significant changes from this bill, in my mind, the most significant is requiring this 8-year check-in. So you've done your nexus study, you've adopted the fee, it's been in place for 8 years. You need to dust that study off and look at it again. There's a requirement in the bill that you can't just use the underlying assumptions from an older nexus study. You really need to examine those. And, because a lot of times what happens is the nexus study might not be fully updated, but a CPI might be added or something like that. So it's really challenging local agencies to make sure they review their assumptions, make sure they're still accurate and kind of calibrated to the policy outcomes they want to see. One of the really significant policy changes in the bill is a requirement to use, for the purposes of calculating what the impact fee is going to be for a particular project, the square footage of the project rather than the number of units. We had a lot of debate about this because we said, well, that's not always the right metric. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And so there is an off-ramp in the law. You just have to show why the alternative metric is better at capturing what the impact is. But there was a lot of discussion about this per square foot concept because the idea was really, if you have a lot of smaller units, should they be paying the same impact fee as a much larger unit if you're doing it on a per unit basis? And for affordable housing projects and for some other things that makes sense. But as I mentioned, there are exceptions, and we were happy to see that the bill does include an off-ramp for that. There's some additional procedural steps added in here. We worked closely with our land use attorneys to make sure that those were actually going to be protective of local agencies rather than an additional burden. And there's additional requirements related to online posting of materials and fee calculations and things of that nature. Next slide.
Okay, great. The next bill, AB 838 by Assemblywoman Friedman. This might be a three-peat as well. For sure it's a repeat, but I think it might be a three-peat. This is something that, yes, local government folks have been, having a back and forth with Senator Friedman for a couple of years. And it does make several changes to local building enforcement processes and procedures. Specifically, the bill is going to require local agencies to promptly compute an inspection when in a violation of either state housing law or lead paint requirements is alleged. And that's the most important part, is that it's alleged. That we're going to have to go out and we're going to have to go ahead and inspect. Upon that inspection, we have to provide free copies of the inspection report and any citations to the tenant. So we have to provide that to them. There are some exclusions here when there's been unfounded complaints in the past. And it also precludes local agencies from making the inspection or the report subject to unreasonable conditions. The most prominent condition here would be requiring that rent is current. And then it really limits our fees, and we can't really recover our costs from individual property owners if we find that there are no violations. So if it's, it's a bit of a challenge for us. I think we're going to have additional workload. It's going to be difficult for us to charge the appropriate fees, and we're kind of just stuck in the middle, maybe between disputes with a tenant and a landlord. So this is something we've been working on for a while, and I think the most egregious pieces I think were taken out in the end, but ultimately though we still had an opposed position along with our local government colleagues.
Yeah. And I'll also point out, Jason, we were successful in getting some tort protections because, this concept of like mandatory versus, discretionary acts, we were worried about additional liability on local governments because of this bill. So worked really hard to negotiate language that we hope will provide some tort protections, provided that, local agencies are following the process. Next slide. So this bill is actually very similar to AB 838, but it's focused specifically on homeless shelters. So it started in a place that was going to have a lot of novel new standards that are actually very different than the typical residential building code. We were able, working closely with Assembly Member Quirk Silva, to refocus it on the basic building habitability standards that exist in state law. We were also successful in getting similar tort protections that were added to AB 838 copied into this framework. But essentially, very similar. If you get a complaint of basically a substandard housing issue in a homeless shelter, the agency that has oversight over the building inspection function, so if it's either the city within a city or the county if it's in an unincorporated area, has to quickly respond and inspect that violation. If a violation is found, issue notice for the shelter owner or operator to fix that, and then also provide copies of reports to the complaining tenant or their agent. There's reporting required in this bill, but it's actually much more limited than what was included in earlier bills. If you have a shelter that's basically refusing to come into compliance, you have to report on that. If you do emergency orders because of basic like a life and immediate sort of safety risk where you're doing an emergency order pursuant to the bill, you have to report on that. And if you have outstanding violations or multiple violations within a 6-month period, 3 or more violations, that information has to be reported to the state. The bill gives the state the ability to say, this shelter operator who's come out of compliance this many times is ineligible for additional state funding. So this was a tough one because obviously we really want to have as much shelter capacity as possible. We want those places to be safe for residents, but again, this is an enforcement sort of based approach here, and it's charging cities and counties with doing that enforcement. Next slide.
Okay. Anything you guys want to clarify further before we jump into more questions?
No, I'll just say, I pulled up our list. We, on my team, we're tracking 152 bills this year. We actively engaged on 60. Jason and I here just discussed the most significant ones that were actually passed and signed. But, if you go back to our presentation from the spring, there's a lot of 2-year bills that are out there. There are a lot of things that stalled out. So happy to answer any questions about the bills we discussed, as well as others that are still pending.
Great. So we do have a number of questions that have already come in, not surprising. But if the folks on the line, if you guys have additional questions, we're still monitoring those as we start to get through some of these. So please feel free to continue to drop those in the questions box. A couple of general questions before we get into the bill-specific ones. We did get a question, if there's a good place to find where the actual government code numbers are as opposed to just the bill numbers. Is that something you guys have anywhere or a good place folks can look for that information?
Yeah, in our write-up that was published today, and all these bills were included, there's hyperlinks from the ABs to the Ledge Council Ledge Info website where you can get the chapter number and then look at the language and context. So in the follow-up information ILG shares, that will be included.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that, Chris, because ours is a little bit delayed. We have the hyperlinks, but you won't see them until December 1st. So check out CSAC.
Perfect. Also have a question if you guys can define what an urban cluster area is, and if that, particularly if that also applies to suburbs.
Yeah, so there's a really great website that I always use, but again, now we're in 2020 census, so it might be a little outdated, but it's called Census Reporter, and it's the one place where I've been able to find really good, just easily accessible mapping. But basically, urbanized areas are the primary urban sort of designation under the census. It's not really going to surprise you where any of those areas are. Urban clusters have to basically have, I think it's like contiguous census blocks with at least 1,500 people per square mile. And they are just physically separate from urbanized areas. So a lot of small cities and then some unincorporated neighborhoods qualify as urban clusters, but there's a very, very specific population density based definition in the census, but the best way to do it is to look for an online mapping tool. And the one I always use is censusreporter.com.
Jason's nodding. Is that the same one you would recommend?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, I started with just using the maps that are on the census website, and those aren't nearly as good as the one that Chris referenced. It's much, much more user-friendly.
And we will have to pay attention as I don't know how much these things change every 10 years. And so I think all the bills are based on the most recent census. So of course, we'll need to be looking for the 2020 data, but it's usually pretty easy to find.
Great, thank you for that clarification. There are a couple additional questions about the owner occupancy piece that we were talking about a little bit earlier. One is if local governments can require more than just an affidavit of the owner occupancy. Is there anything that could local governments go above and beyond what's in the state law essentially?
No, I don't believe so. It authorizes us to do the owner occupancy requirement via the affidavit. So I don't think we could require anything additionally.
Okay. And then an additional question in a similar vein. Does the owner occupancy, is that the date of the application is submitted or the date that the project would be completed? Like when would they have to have that in hand, I think is the question.
That's a good question. Let me pull up the bill. Maybe we move on to the question. I'll pull it up real quick and then get back. Yeah.
I've got it up, Jason, and Ledge Council Digest says 3 years from the date of approval of the urban lot split, with an exception for kind of community land trust. And then, so let me see for the, just for the duplex provision, I imagine that's mirrored. So I think it would be kind of from when the, that happens at the end of the process, right? So I think it would be something you would include in all the application materials, and it would kind of be that date of when it's approved. That would be my best guess based on how it's drafted here.
Great, thank you. This is obviously kind of just your opinion, but do either of you anticipate any legal challenges to SB 9?
I'm not aware of any. I believe there is a legal challenge of SB 10 related specifically to the voter approval. And, you know, I am not an attorney and don't want to pretend to be one. So I do know the California Constitution is really deferential to the local initiative and the state initiative. So we'll see what happens with that, but not aware of anything on SB 9.
Yeah, with regard to SB 9, I haven't heard anything specific, but I've heard lots of rumbling. So, you know, I don't know if that's going to turn into anything. I mean, we'll know, I think, in the coming weeks, you know, couple months. But I think folks are interested, but I haven't seen anything formal.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Going back to 9 and SB 9 and SB 10, do either of those have any actual affordability requirements in the language that you're aware of?
No,
neither one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and there, you know, it was a funny conversation because, you know, if you were going to require 1 of 2 units to be BMR, you're unlikely to get them, you know. So the goal was to do, you know, this quote unquote missing middle. And I think it'll be interesting to see what the uptake is and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think, the author was really trying to get it, maybe affordability by design, much like folks argue about ADUs, that just on the natural, they'll be a little bit more affordable, but no formal affordability requirements.
And I know another thing that was really important to the Senate working group that kind of put together some of these core bills that the Senate passed was providing ownership opportunities and giving people the opportunity to build wealth with the property that they already own. So that was a big reason for the lot split provision, as I understand it. So there's different takes on kind of what the affordability goal is and how you're going to financially help the folks who are going to live in or be a part of developing one of these projects.
Yeah, and with regard to SB 10, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, since it's an opt-in bill that really addresses upzoning, I would think that a city's existing inclusionary housing ordinance would still apply. So I think if a city wanted to have affordability built into an SB 10 project, I don't recall anything in there that would say you can't do that. But I mean, I'd have your city attorney double check, but I believe you could.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. A lot of questions trying to pull through here. You spoke to this a little bit earlier, but anything else to provide clarity on SB 9 as it applies to high fire severity zones?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's very clear that if a project is built pursuant to the applicable building code, which includes codes that apply specifically in high fire risk zones, then it's allowed. I think the open question is whether location in a very high fire hazard severity zone plus some mitigating factor like you have one way in and out of a neighborhood and things like that. I think that's a question for your attorneys of can you make that finding by a preponderance of evidence that that risk is there, it's a life and health and safety issue and you can't mitigate it. But I think it's abundantly clear from the text of that cross-reference to SB 35 that if you're in compliance with the applicable building standards that apply to fire zones, then you meet that standard.
Jason, anything to add on that front, or should we move on?
I concur completely. Yep.
Okay. Sorry, you guys have a lot of questions. I'm trying to get through these and figure out which ones we've already asked. With SB 9, can local governments require project frontage improvements, or are those classified as off-site?
If you by frontage you mean like abutting the public right-of-way, my understanding of the MAP Act is that that is an off-site improvement. An on-site improvement would be things like access and the drainage and things like that. But sidewalk, curb and gutter, I believe that's considered an off-site improvement. But again, that is a county council or city attorney question. Well, I mean, one of the things that I know motivated that language was they didn't want to be able to locals to be able to require dedication of right-of-way. A lot of counties get right-of-way through off-site improvements, through lot splits and things of that nature. They could do it. The alternative is you can get it through eminent domain, right? So it's a policy question in planning world whether that's the best way to get the right-of-way, but I think that was one of the motivating factors.
Okay, and there's an explicit question related to sidewalks in that same vein, so I think that you probably just addressed that as well, but always good to check with your county council or city attorney on some of those pieces as well. Can either of you speak to how these bills would impact historic structures? Would there be any difference on how that would be applied, or?
I defer to Jason on that.
Yeah, and this is for SB 9, right, as far as the historic structures?
I believe so.
Yeah, I want to say that one of the exemptions for where it can be located is that, you know, it can't be located within a historic or a landmark district, or it's a site that has, yeah, it's a historic or landmark district for state or a local designation. So if it's historic, if it's a landmark, then that site, you know, cannot be used, you know, for a split or a duplex. And it would also apply, I believe, to like demolishing it and, you know, redoing it. I think it would apply to that as well.
And I think this question might be a little bit broader than just SB9, but are ADUs allowed when there's not a lot split? Would that refer back to any local ordinances they had on ADUs or any insight there?
Yeah, sure. So the ADU provisions, if let's just say you're not going to split the lot, and it's a vacant lot, you could add, you know, 2 units to that lot, and then you could do an ADU and a JDU, you know, as well. And the bill says you can do 4 max.
A question about objective design standards. Can those standards include connections, sewer, like infrastructure connections around sewer and wastewater and things like that? And then any thoughts on if those services are not available? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's covered by the on-site improvements, as well as I think those would largely be objective standards within your relevant ordinances, or, you know, if you have a special district or someone doing it, it's a whole other question. I think we've had an argument over the years in the county perspective of like, okay, should we be allowing ADUs by right on lots that aren't served with urban infrastructure? And I want to recall something that we got into a bill that was very strange, but was attempted to get at the issue of like, okay, is there adequate you know, capacity for septic for this? Is requiring a percolation test to be part of the application materials. And I want to, yeah, it's so residential units connected to an on-site water treatment system, percolation tests completed within the last 5 years, or if the percolation test has been recertified within the last 10 years. And that was to make sure the environmental health people had enough information to determine whether you were going to create issues by, you know, having more units hooked up to the system, or if there was going to be room for another system. So it was kind of an odd way of addressing that issue, but that's the most on point language in the bill on that topic.
There's also a question about if SB9 can take SB 743 into consideration around DMTs or CEQA.
That's a good question. I mean, I certainly would check with council, but I don't think so. Since it's ministerial, we just have to do it. I mean, if you meet the criteria, if you're on a site that's not one of the exempt sites, we just have to do it. So, but I would double check with your attorney, but yeah, it doesn't seem to apply.
Yeah, I think the whole purpose is to get out, well, not the whole purpose, but a significant purpose of the bill is to avoid CEQA review. So I agree with Jason on that.
Move away from SB9 for just a second. There's a question about SB8 and how the SB8 application would be reviewed with SB 330.
I mean, I think it's literally, I'm not sure I understand the question, because it's literally the same language with some technical changes, and crossing out one date and putting a new date. So it's the same application process with some, mostly I would say, clarifying in terms of the applicability. I think there was also some changes related to demolition protections. But is the question like, for an application that was submitted before January 1, 2021, how does the new stuff apply?
I don't have any additional context there. If the person that submitted that wants to clarify that further, we might be able to get you a more clear response. But if I'm understanding Chris correctly, it's the a very similar application with just some different dates on it, so it shouldn't have too much of an impact.
That would be my understanding, but again, that's a, if there are specific facts, I would ask council.
It's always a good default, right? Check with your county council or your city attorney.
We just argue about the bills. We don't interpret them.
Let's see here. Another question about objective design and development standards. Can they include minimum lot sizes, to your knowledge?
Well, I think they, okay. I think theoretically, yeah, well, there's a specific provision that says that the lots can be no smaller than 1,200 square feet each that are created by the split. They can, but you know, as far as your objective standards, I mean, it's pretty clear that you can have objective standards as long as they don't prevent the developments from occurring. So you have a fair amount of latitude. I mean, as long as they're clear and concise and they're objective and it doesn't prevent the development, you can require quite a bit.
All right, let's see here. I have a question for Sohab, if you're still on the line. They're asking about the explainer graphics that you mentioned earlier, when they'll be available. Do you have any timeline on any of that?
Yeah, I would say early next year, so maybe around February, March.
Okay, perfect. And we do have a couple of requests for TA plans that we will share with you after the fact, but for a reminder for the folks on the line, if you guys have a request for that or any tools that you're interested in, also please be sharing those with us. We're tracking those as well as the questions. And then Sohab, also for you, and this could just be something to add to the list of tools or resources that might be of interest to folks, but do you know of any venue for cities and counties to kind of connect and talk to each other about how they're approaching housing topics, or just any kind of format? I think Jason, Chris, you guys have thoughts on this too, but any venue or format for folks to kind of do that peer learning and information exchange?
Yeah, so we have heard that through the development of these TA plans across the state that there's a need for that kind of forum. So a couple things that we're exploring right now, we will finalize and implement one of these. One is where it's an online help desk. So you can, as a city planner or city staff, you can ask a question and we'll have local experienced planners and consultants on the other end of that, helping you answer questions, anything related to implementing land use and planning policies. And then it can kind of act as a Reddit forum where when a question is answered, it'll still be there. So you can kind of still see what the response was and what the conversations were. And you can also comment and kind of add to it. So like a Reddit forum or, I don't know, a Facebook post or whatever people can relate to most. That's one idea we're thinking about through a help desk. Another idea is we are thinking about setting up just some kind of online forum where local planners can talk amongst each other. If you would like to, you can communicate to HCD specialists in particular topic areas. We also have a 300 people consulting team that includes various experts on CEQA, public engagement, housing, by right zoning, objective design standards, all these new laws that we talked about today. So we can set up that forum where you can also contact them, ask them questions, and also talk to your peers to see, you know, hey, what are you doing on this particular topic? How are you implementing this? So we are exploring those avenues. If it's something that you feel like, if you have more guidance on how you would like that scoped out, please let me know, because it's going to be made for all of you guys. So just however you would like it set up, we can do that.
Great. Jason or Chris, any additional thoughts? I know you guys both also have policy committees where folks and other conferences and trainings where folks obviously get together for your respective agencies.
Yeah, we have for the planning director side, California County Planning Directors Association. I know they have a really active listserv. It's kind of a smaller group than the cities because there's only 58 of us, but they'll be meeting in March, and they're a great resource for folks. And then on the elected side or county administrator side, we're always happy to put stuff on the agenda or send out surveys and things of that nature. So we'll be having some discussion. We have Director Velasquez confirmed for presenting at our Housing, Land Use, and Transportation Policy Committee meeting next month, December 1st. So if any supervisors are interested, that's a great forum to discuss some of these issues.
Great.
Yeah, very similar to CSAC. I mean, we certainly have our policy committees, but we also do roundtables, which has been really effective. Where our cities get together, exchange ideas. It's really just amongst themselves. Our planning directors, we meet monthly as well. So if folks are interested, shoot me an email. I'll be more than happy to connect with you to put together a roundtable. Megan McKelvey, and our member services manager, she handles all of those and has done a fantastic job. I think over the last year and a half, I think we've done like 100 of them. I mean, it's been pretty amazing on any topic you can dream of. We've done it. So yeah, please reach out. I'd be happy to throw one together.
Great. Thank you for that. And I kind of on a related note, there's a couple of questions about training. So also just want to put in a plug for both of our affiliates here, the League and CSAC, who do a ton of training. The League's Planning Commissioners Academy comes up in March. CSAC's annual meeting is in a few weeks now, and I know you guys definitely have your policy committees and other folks convene at those. As I mentioned at the outset of this, we will ILG will be doing a number of planning commissioner trainings coming into 2022. So there's a lot of resources out there for you all on the training side of things as well. So I would just encourage you to connect with your associations, with ILG. APA also does a ton of training on these topics. So just definitely connect with some of the associations in this space. A lot of training opportunities available. Checking our time here, we're getting a little bit close. I would like to have some time to, obviously we did a similar presentation to this back in April at the outset of the legislative session and things that were coming down. And then, as you mentioned, there's a lot of things that didn't pass this year. Maybe can we take a few minutes and talk about some of the things you guys think might come back around in the next legislative cycle, or things that are still kind of out there that is on your radar?
I think maybe spurred on by the success of the Senate working group and kind of getting a cross section of members of the Democratic caucus together and coming up with some bill ideas, several of which were pretty significant bills and got across the finish line. The Assembly has put together a working group. They've been going around different parts of the state, having some invite-only panels, but we were at some of them and have been hearing things. There's a lot of focus on home ownership. We saw a lot of bills stall this year that would have kind of created by right processes for subdivisions, which I think is something that's very politically controversial for a few different reasons, but there's several of those out there. There's some much more prescriptive bills on impact fees that we are hoping won't move forward after, we got pretty close in our negotiations on AB 602 this year. Unfortunately, didn't get everything we wanted, but that was it's going to be a significant implementation effort for local agencies. And we always want the state to understand that, they pass the bill and they come back next session and have new ideas, but we got to go through all of our processes. We got to update our ordinances, go through our local advisory committees. I used to sit on those when I was in local government. So, when everything's a moving target, it does become difficult. So I'm hoping we focus on different things next year and not just doubling down on things that were hot topics this year. But the thing I do keep hearing is home ownership. So what that looks like will be interesting to see.
Yeah, my hopes align with Chris's. I hope they don't try to, keep folks on local government. I mean, but I think the one thing we do know is that the legislature has this insatiable appetite to change housing law every year. And I know, preaching to the choir here, but it's every year we're having to update, density bonus law. We have to update, our ADU ordinances. I mean, it's a little out of control. So, I mean, we would certainly hope that the legislature could hit pause and let's implement the dozens upon dozens of bills that have passed over the recent, handful of years before we start trying to tackle, new issues. But, I agree with Chris. I mean, we're certainly going to see stuff around fees. I think the bills that fizzled out this year around, conversion of retail sites and commercial sites, those are likely to come back. We've been dealing with those for a few consecutive years. There was a bill that failed that dealt with an appeals body over at HCD to deal with certain housing projects that may have been denied unlawfully. That's likely to continue. We always see stuff on parking. The Coastal Commission has been longing to get more jurisdiction over housing in the coastal zone. That's popped up a few times in the last recent years. That bill's still alive. So the one thing to note, though, is that these bills, some of them that failed this past year, are going to need to move out of their house of origin in January. So there'll be a lot of activity in January trying to clean up last year's leftovers. And then those that don't get out of that original house will be dead for the year. But hey, there's always a second chance. You get bill introduction deadline doesn't end until the end of February. So you can, modify it a little bit and reintroduce it. So just keep an eye for the January, and then February, we'll get the good universe of measures. The other thing too to keep in mind is that as we look forward to next year, we're creeping up into an election year, and we're going to see ballot measures. We're already starting to see ballot measures surface. Folks are gathering signatures, and there's some significant ones out there for local government, and we're paying a very, very close attention to those as signatures gathered, whether they become real or not. So we can't lose track of the ballot. That's become a very popular place to legislate, right? So it's something we definitely can't lose sight of.
Well, and to leverage local government, there's a very similar to a recent proposition putting really difficult limits on local abilities to raise taxes, which was used to extract concessions on statewide, soda things. So it's not just on the land use and planning side, it's on our revenue side as well, I think is significant. One thing I neglected to mention is Senator Atkins has a vehicle for a housing bond, so I want to pay close attention to that. I don't know how much appetite there might be. There's been a lot of general fund money put into housing this year, which is really remarkable. The beginning of my career, there was very little, and now it's a flood, and it's almost difficult for folks to keep track of all the opportunities that are out there. But another bond measure is an opportunity to advance some things that are important to locals. Things we are always looking at is the infrastructure side in county world. We've got the planning obligation, but do we have the physical infrastructure to support the development? And how can we create tools with the state to help expedite that?
Yeah, I'm great, Chris. You mentioned, the money side of things, because, I saw with the LAO that we're looking at maybe a $10 to $15 billion surplus in the coming year. That's on top of the nearly $100 billion in federal and other surplus money that the legislature had this year. So again, we have a ton of money that can go out. And of course, we're always fighting hard to make sure we have additional money for homelessness, for mental health services, for housing, for affordable housing, for infrastructure. So, we're definitely going to be asking the legislature, hey, you guys have $10 to $15 billion extra. Local governments need some of these improvements as well. So we'll definitely be fighting for some of those dollars. And I know CSAC is a huge supporter of all those things as well, and fights for budget dollars every year right alongside of this. So.
Great. Thank you guys for those thoughts. A lot of things to kind of keep an eye out for as we move into the end of this year and early next year. Just have a couple of closing items for everybody and a couple of reminders. So apologies that we did not get through all the questions as we anticipated. We got a lot of questions and we held quite a bit of time, but I apologize if we did not get to your question. I will share contact information here in just a second, and so please feel free to follow up if we did not get to your question. I will be sending out a number of resources and information that we talked about today in a follow-up email that will probably go early next week. But again, I'll make sure to include that Housing Hub site that Sohab mentioned with all of the technical assistance tools that are coming out. I'll be sure to share information about the webinar that Jason mentioned that the league will be putting on in a few weeks as an overview of all of the legislative activity that happened over this year. And we'll also link to the information that Chris shared in terms of their overview of the legislative session that went out in their newsletter today. And the funding resources that Sohab mentioned. So I'll pull together a lot of this information and package it up for you all in an email. We'll also share the recording of this webinar, so if you want to go back and revisit something that was said, we covered a lot of information here. So that will be part of that email as well as the slide deck. So you'll have a lot of things to come back to if you have questions after the fact. But just a couple of quick things to share with you all. As I mentioned at the outset, this webinar was one in a series of webinars that we did over the past 8 months or so. Talked about things like climate resiliency, so some of the fire zone questions you had might be answered there. We talked about equity in housing and affirming fair housing, community engagement, that came up a couple of times today. So we did a lot of work in these spaces, so these are all on our website recorded. So please feel free to check those out if you missed any of those and are interested in any of those topic areas. This is just how to stay in contact with ILG. As we've mentioned, we're part of that statewide team, so we'll be doing a lot of training and other resources putting out, so definitely feel free to stay connected with us in this way. And then here's everybody's emails, so I'll leave this up for just a second as we close everything out, so you can definitely get in touch with us after the fact. But Jason, Chris, still have any closing thoughts before we close out today's webinar?
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all the work and resources.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
I want to thank all of you guys for taking the time to participate and share all of your expertise this afternoon. That was a lot, and there was a lot of questions, so really appreciate that. And a big thank you to everybody on the line who joined us this afternoon to hear about some of these really important updates and things that are coming down the pipeline. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much.